Not my girl. It was as though the wings of 1,000 birds soared in my heart, propelled me back to my family. I leapt over the side of the boat and ran toward my mother. Her face remained as still as stone. "Not my girl," she called in what little English she knew. The birds in my heart fell from their sky. I caught a glint of my own reflection in my mother's hard eyes. The long braids she had once lovingly plaited had been cut away, along with everything she had remembered of me. I had grown very tall and thin from the 2 years of hard chores and poor meals at the outsider's school. When I left for Avalik, I was just 8. Now I was 10. In that time, I had learned how to add numbers and how to read books. I had perfect table manners and knew when to say my prayers. I could speak English and French, but I no longer knew the words in my own language to tell my mother that I was her girl. "Not my girl," rang out like a slap in the ruler on the desk. I turned to my sisters and brother. They just stared. I tensed to run, but my father caught me in a tight embrace. "Alamon," he whispered. I had not heard my Inuit name in so long. I thought it might shatter like an eggshell with the weight of my father's voice. At the school, I was only known by my Christian name, Margaret. I buried my head in my father's smoky parka, turning it wet with tears. I felt a touch, much gentler than my father's strong grasp, as my mother's arms joined his. Together, they sheltered me in a safe place between them. We might have embraced forever had my tummy not growled. Luckily, my mother had brought my favorite foods for me: whale blubber muktuk and dried fish pipsy. No more cabbage soup, porridge, or muskrat like I was fed at the school. I took a piece of muktuk and shoved it in my mouth. I chewed it and tried to wrestle the rubbery chunk down, but my throat closed and my stomach turned, and I had to spit it out. I followed my family silently as they honked away like a gaggle of geese. I wondered what kind of bird I had become. I no longer felt like I belonged to this flock. As we neared our tent, I caught sight of my father's sled dogs. I ran eagerly toward one, but she sprang at me with a fierce snap. "Wait until you wear our scent again, Alamon," my father said, reassuring me with the English he had learned as a boy at the outsider's school. My first few weeks at home were difficult. I could not eat the food my mother prepared. I relied on my father to translate almost everything, and I had lost the skills I needed to be useful. I could not set traps, skin hares, or pluck geese. I knew how to recite verses and make my bed, but those things did not help feed my family. I wished my older sister had not moved away. She had been to the outsider's school. She would have understood how hard it was to return home a stranger. One day after I untangled a fishing net, my mother gestured me to go and play. I ran straight for my friend Agnes's house. She was my best friend from school, and I wanted to see if she would like to go hunting for goose eggs, a food we both loved. Her mother met me at the door with a stern look. Agnes joined her. "My mother and father say I'm an outsider now. They do not want me playing with the children from the school," Agnes said timidly before closing the door. Agnes was my only friend, and her words stung almost as deeply as my mother saying, "Not my girl." Dizzy with hunger and disappointment, I stumbled home. A dog leapt up as I approached. Wanting to know if I would always be an outsider, I offered a hand. The dog answered with a snarl and a flash of sharp teeth that nearly took off my fingers. I retreated to the corner of the tent and hid in my favorite book until my family returned. My sister had caught many fish, and I was jealous. Then my mother placed her ulu in my hands. She guided the knife up the fish's belly and patiently showed me how to gut it. That night, as I reached for a piece of fish, I thought for a moment how embarrassed I would be if the nuns could see me eating with my hands. But I was proud that I had helped prepare the fish. It had been a long while since we had a meal I could eat, so I gorged myself. When the air turned crisp again, one of the dogs had a litter of pups. Agnes would love them. I had relearned many of the words of my people, so I decided to try and see her again. I carefully snatched a soft pup, belted it to the back of my parka like a baby, and set off. My hand trembled as it struck her door. No one answered. After a long wait, I gave up. I walked down the beach, took out my puppy, and played with it, and sang songs I remembered from school. Arriving home late for supper, I quickly stripped off my parka, forgetting the puppy. My father leapt and caught it just before it hit the floor. "Alamon!" my mother shouted. As I looked at the nearly lifeless body, I felt a searing of cold remorse. "How long have you had this puppy?" my father asked. I shrugged. "Since morning." My father knelt down. "Alamon, puppies need their mother's milk." "Will it die?" I asked. "I'm not sure," he said sadly. It was all too much. I turned and ran out into the night where the iridescent fawns of the northern lights danced down from the sky. My grandmother once told me that if I whistled to them, their tendrils would reach down and snatch me away. I whistled until my lips hurt, but they ignored me. Instead of scolding me when I returned, my father called me to the fire and handed me an eyedropper. I took it, sucked up some rice water, and released it into the puppy's mouth. I had nursed patients at the hospital next to the school and knew how to care for the sick. I stayed up all night feeding my little patient. In the morning, we took the puppy outside. At first, his mother pushed him away. He whimpered. Like me, he no longer carried the scent of his family. I closed my eyes and wished with all my heart I'd never taken him. When I looked again, his mother was licking him. My father squeezed me to him and smiled. By the time the snow came, eating was getting easier. And while I was still happy to share my muktuk with the puppy, I kept the Pipsy for myself. I had regained my family scent and often helped my father with the dogs. One day he asked me to join on a hunting trip. I was ecstatic. I loved traveling by dog sled. We were far out on the barren tundra when my father asked, "Alamon, do you know the dog commands?" "Yes," I said confidently. "Gee means go right and left is haw." He laughed, hopping off and leaving me in command. The dogs were moving fast and my heart was racing. "Ha!" I called excitedly, meaning to avoid the pond on the left, but I had confused my commands and the dogs went toward the pond. "Gee, gee," I shouted. The dogs bolted sharply right. "Ha, ha," I countered. They darted so quickly left I nearly flew off the sled. I panicked and repeated, "Ha, ha." My command tamed the line to the tight coil that slowed into a gradual stop. "Atta girl, Alamon," my father shouted. As we rode back to town, I felt proud, standing ahead of him on the runners. I was sure he was proud too. He let me drive often after that. On Christmas morning, I awoke to the smell of bannock. My father sat like Santa with a load of presents. He gave my brother a train and my sister's beautiful porcelain dolls, and there was nothing for me. I cried. I had tried so hard, but still did not belong. "What's wrong?" my father asked. "I wanted a doll," I sobbed. "I thought you were too old for dogs," he teased. Maybe you aren't big enough for your own dog sled." "My own dog sled?" I ran outside to find 6 dogs hitched to a new sled. I hopped on and drove around and around town beneath the dancing northern lights. I passed by Agnes and her mother. At that speed I could not see their expressions, but they both waved and cheered. As I neared home, I saw that my father had his own team of dogs hitched and my brother and sisters loaded in his sled. I slowed, allowing my mother to climb on the runners behind me, my eyelashes freezing with tears. As we all sped off like a swift-winged flock, the sound of my mother's voice filled my ears. "My girl," she shouted proudly, and the birds rose up in my heart to soar high once again.